So my name is Marjolein. I'm working as a research associate and lecturer at the Free University of Amsterdam. And today I will present a paper that I'm working on with two colleagues at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where I was based before moving to the Netherlands. So the starting point of this paper is the observation that an increasing number of countries is adopting standardized tests, and that these tests are increasingly often used to measure the performance of schools and teachers and to hold educational actors accountable for the achievement of centrally defined learning objectives. What we see, this reform approach is commonly referred to as performance-based accountability, and we see that this has become a near universal trend spreading around the globe. A key assumption or premise behind performance-based accountability is that being held accountable will generate beneficial forms of pressure, which will motivate educators or school leaders and teachers to perform better and to adapt their practices, so to meet accountability expectations in a more efficient way, and also to use achievement data that is generated by standardized tests for school improvement purposes. So basically to reflect on and to improve educational practices. When we look at the evidence to this claim, it's often assumed that high-stakes accountability systems are more likely to generate high levels of pressure and as such to generate behavioral effects. So high-stakes accountability systems are those systems where significant accountability consequences are attached to performance. So you can think of financial incentives or sanctions, you can think of school closures, you can think of hiring and firing decisions. You can think of the publication of results. So these consequences are often assumed to be key drivers of pressure and of behavioral change. And when we look at what studies actually show on the basis of this assumption, there are many studies that confirm this, that high stakes accountability is indeed associated with increased levels of stress and increased level of pressures felt by school actors, and also a significant impact on their decisions and behavior. But there is also a body of evidence that shows that some of these behavioral effects could be classified as undesired. For example, teaching to the test, or curriculum narrowing, or exempting low-performing students from sitting tests, or cheating. There's a whole range of these type of undesired effects, sometimes also referred to as opportunistic behavior. But more recently, there are studies that increasingly start to question whether these behavioral effects of performance pressure are really directly related to the consequences at stake. And a second question is whether these consequences, usually of an administrative nature, so think of, for example, school closures or hiring and firing decisions, are really the most relevant drivers of pressure. And these questions are emerging because we see there is a growing body of evidence conducted in so-called low-stakes accountability systems that are showing that also educators working in these so-called low-stakes accountability systems, so where these significant accountability consequences are absent, are actually also experiencing high levels of performative pressure. At the same time, we're seeing that some of the side effects associated with accountability reforms, which were often particularly associated with high stakes accountability, for example, teaching to the test, are also emerging in low stakes accountability systems. So what appears from these studies is that the objective level of pressure, which could be defined as the formal consequences, for example, these administrative consequences that are determined by the formal account holder, which are often administrative bodies, do not always align to the level of pressure, the pressure to perform, that school actors actually experience, that they feel. So currently, it still remains a bit of a black box how we can explain the emergence of performative pressure in low stakes accountability systems. So in systems where you could say there is really nothing at stake, or at least educators do not risk losing their job or seeing their school close down. But there are a number of factors that are now being highlighted, that are emerging in the literature of what could explain pressure in low stakes accountability systems. So of course, it can relate to the role of third-party account holders, such as parents. Parents can exercise pressure on schools when they use, for example, the results of standardized tests to raise their voice, to complain about the performance, about the quality of a school, or in case they have an opportunity to do so, to actually switch schools. And in that sense, they could even put the existence of the school itself in danger. Other studies show that the media might play an important role. So there are, in many cases, the results from standardized tests are published, and the media are quite interested in reporting on these tests, and sometimes use these tests to shame and blame schools. And there are some studies that show that this type of media coverage can generate the adoption of panic measures by school actors, basically to quickly raise performance, so to avoid further public humiliation. And then finally, self-imposed pressure is put forward as a possible determinant of pressure. So this could be due to the incorporation of test scores as proxies of professional success, meaning that educators start to put pressure on themselves to make sure that they perform because they see it as an important professional responsibility. So to our knowledge, there are very few studies that have looked at the determinants of pressure in low stakes accountability systems. So what we do in this study, we explore the determinants of performative pressure in the Norwegian context. So we explore the following question: to what extent do Norwegian school leaders and teachers experience pressure to obtain high test scores? What are the determinants of performative pressure in low stakes accountability regimes? How do these potential sources of pressure relate to different perceived or experienced pressure levels? And how do these potential sources interact in generating pressure? So the Norwegian context was chosen because we see that national test and value-added models are increasingly used for accountability purposes, but the accountability system remains characterized by a relative absence of material consequences, as well as low levels of marketization. There are very few private schools, and school choice is generally restricted. So the main consequences faced by school leaders and by teachers are, on the one hand, administrative control. So the principal is asked to explain and to justify performance to the municipal superintendent, who is the formal account holder in Norway. In case of underperformance, the municipal superintendent might offer support or help to make sure that that performance will improve. And also the results are published on a government website, but this in combination with restricted school choice. In the case of free school choice, you could consider the publication of results, of course, a high stakes policy, because it could have very significant effects on schools. What makes Norway also interesting is that there is a lot of local variation in accountability regimes. So there is, the municipalities can exercise some sort of discretion in what types of consequences are attached to performance, for example. And there are a minority of municipalities, often those more urbanized, they are really raising the stakes. So they are, for example, introducing performance contracts and also performance-based pay. What we then also see is, besides variation in the local accountability regimes, we see variation in the role of third-party account holders. So the role of parents, for example, so school choice is generally restricted, but there are some municipalities, again, often those more urbanized, that are trying to allow for some sort of choice for parents, even though it has nothing to do with the degrees of choice that families, for example, in the Netherlands enjoy, but they allow some sort of choice. If there is a spot available at a school, then parents could go there. They're not restricted to going to their neighborhood school. And then the media, we did a systematic analysis on how local newspapers cover standardized testing, and we identified quite a lot of interesting differences. For example, there are some local newspapers very critically debating the testing issue, while others are predominantly using standardized test scores to rank schools and really focused on narratives of success and failure. So the study relies on both quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data derived from an electronic survey that we administered to school leaders and teachers in a representative sample of primary and lower secondary schools in urban municipalities, and secondary data on a range of different variables. We combined this with qualitative data derived from in-depth interviews with school principals and teachers. So the quantitative analysis mainly serves to identify what are the determinants of different levels of pressure among school actors, and how do these different sources of pressure interact. And then the qualitative analysis really served to deepen the understanding of different sources of pressure. There were a few things that we couldn't explain with the quantitative data, and that generated a lot of new questions that we tried to explore by means of conducting interviews. So this is still ongoing. What we are planning to do is to use the variable how much pressure do you feel to get good results in a national test as the dependent variable. Respondents had the opportunity to answer on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 indicated no pressure at all and 7 an extreme amount of pressure. And what we want to include as the explanatory variables in the model is, on one hand, the characteristics of the accountability regime, so the consequences attached to test performance, as well as the pressure exercised by the formal account holder, so the municipal superintendent. Then we want to take into account the school context, take into account the students' composition, socioeconomic background, as well as school performance. We will use school choice, unfortunately, as a dummy variable, because we only can get data on whether there are freer school choice regulations or not, but we cannot get any data, or at least incomplete data, about how often it is used. Then we want to take into account a personal opinion on the national test as a valid and reliable measure of school quality and teacher work. And finally, we want to use the database that we constructed on local media coverage also to try to map what is exactly the influence of different forms of media coverage on standardized testing on pressure levels. So what I will present now is still a bit descriptive, because we are not there yet. We're still waiting on secondary data on the socioeconomic background of students before we will start. But there are some interesting findings emerging. The first finding is, of course, to what extent, or the first question that we wanted to answer is, to what extent do school leaders and teachers feel pressure to get good results in the tests? And these figures display performative pressure levels that are reported by school leaders and by teachers. If you look at the teachers, you see that they seem to be a bit more distributed more homogeneously across the categories. School leaders are more concentrated in the categories 4 to 6, but in both cases they are skewed towards the higher categories of which in this case would imply that the majority of them does experience quite high levels of performative pressure. Then we wanted to look, okay, what is exactly at stake? What is exactly at stake for principals, for teachers, for schools? And it appears that in particular the reputation that is seen as the main consequence attached to test performance, so the professional reputation of school leaders and teachers, and the reputation of the school. And this we found very interesting when we saw this. This might actually be a key reason why low stakes accountability regimes are generating high levels of pressure. So basically the potential of the accountability system to alter the reputation of schools and of school actors. And in this sense, of course, external audiences would play a very important role in modulating the effects modulating the reputational effects of accountability. When we look at the pressure actors, then indeed the results confirm the importance of the local authority as a main pressure actor, in particular for school leaders, which is not surprising since school leaders are asked to explain the results to the local authority, to the municipality. But they're not the only one. For example, the media also contributes with generating pressure. They're part of the picture, especially for teachers. But there's a big difference between whether the media is considered a pressure actor or not. And this is something we would like to explore more to see how different forms of media coverage actually relate to different pressure levels. Then we see that parents are part of the picture, but again, they're for some, and for others they are not. And then finally, we see self-imposed pressure, which is in particularly experienced by school leaders. So we noticed that reputation plays an important role, but we wanted to know more about what are these reputational effects exactly, in particular in a context where school choice is restricted. As I told you, there are these exceptions. So there are some municipalities where parents are enjoying some choice, and indeed there are principles confirming that there's a minority of parents that seems to be using these test scores when they're so-called shopping for schools, so when they're choosing which schools they're going to send their child to. What seems to be a bit more common is that parents use these scores to raise their voice and to complain and to put pressure, for example, on teachers to raise performance, to do better, to focus also on academic skills, academic competencies. But there are also other effects. For example, when a school is blamed in the media for underperformance, teachers explain how that affects student confidence and how that affects their sense of being, their pride basically of their school. It can also affect teacher motivation. So in that sense, it can have important consequences for the school. And it can affect teacher recruitment. So the reputation also matters not only for attracting students, but also for attracting teachers. So principals explain that it gets more difficult when a school has a bad reputation to attract the teachers that they're looking for. There's quite a big competition for teachers going on. So what we expect is that these reputational effects are more likely to be more strongly felt in municipalities where the local press is very active, and also in municipalities where there are these freer regulations around school choice. And something else that we wanted to explore more with the qualitative data was the self-imposed pressure. Where does that come from? How can we explain self-imposed pressure? And one of the findings appears that yes, there are a number of principals, actually quite substantial number of principals that have really internalized basic skills as something they really see as their professional responsibility. So for example, one principal mentioned, if you cannot read, you will not succeed in society. You won't, you get no education. We know that 40 to 60% of the kids at this school does not finish high school. What kind of job opportunities they get as they get older? It can be difficult. So my mandate is that I should reach an adequate level in reading, math, and English. We must get there. So this is really important for principals, and this can result in principals putting pressure on themselves to make sure that that students learn those skills. So to conclude, because I see that the time is running, what these studies confirm is that, again, it's adding to a range of different studies that shows that performative pressure also emerges in low stakes contexts and beyond the formal account holder. It is important to take into account these third-party account holders and also the self as actors that are contributing with pressure. It's often concluded, it's often mentioned that nothing is at stake for Norwegian educators, but reputational consequences have received very little attention, and they might actually form, together with self-imposed pressure, really part of the puzzle of why educators are experiencing pressure. And then finally, the local authority also plays a very interesting dual role in Norway, because they are not only holding accountable, but they are also held accountable themselves. So this creates a very interesting dynamic. So I will end here, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.